Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I know it's quite difficult to get here at 9:15 in the morning, especially when it's raining, so really appreciate you joining us today. Some housekeeping rules. If you put on your headphones, you'll be able to hear everyone a lot better. And it's also so the people watching on the live stream can hear us as well. I think that's all the housekeeping rules. Yes. Very importantly, don't run away with the headsets because Charlotte will run after you and you'll get into lots of trouble. So yes, please leave them on your seats when you're done. Fantastic. So welcome to our panel, Adapting in Adversity, the Role of Governance in Climate Adaptation. I'm Anna Renfrew. I work for Mercy Corps, which is an organisation working in over 40 countries around the world, responding to climate change, conflict and instability, helping people survive humanitarian crises and helping them build better lives. We know that for countries characterized as fragile and conflict affected, that the climate crisis has exposed new sets of vulnerabilities that make it difficult to cope, adapt and thrive. Many of these nations are geographically exposed to extreme and persistent climate hazards, and the same characteristics that define them as fragile, often so weak institutions, poor governance and conflict also ensure that they struggle to cope. Too frequently, we also find that fragility itself serves as a barrier to receiving climate adaptation finance, which is a lifeline for many communities around the world. So some Mercy Corps is that in 2022, there was a total of 32 billion mobilized for climate adaptation finance globally. But for the top 10 most fragile states, they received less than 1% of total flows. So a tiny, tiny amount. As an organisation that has been working at the intersection of climate change, conflict and fragility for a decade, our programming experience has shown us that while situations of fragility and conflict do present unique challenges to climate adaptation, these barriers are already being overcome by those on the front lines of the crisis. So, I should say before we move on, Mercy Corps are very proud to endorse the common principles for effective finance and action for relief, recovery and peace, which have been championed by the UK. Maybe Peter, I'll ask you about that later. These principles provide clear guidance on how to deliver effective, conflict-sensitive climate adaptation in places affected by fragility. So, without further ado, I will introduce our excellent panelists who are going to showcase that peace and governance interventions often are adaptation actions as they create an enabling environment that supports climate adaptation in many of the places that we're talking about. So, Ruth Rhodes Allen, hi, is the President and Chief Collaboration Officer at CDA. In this role, she weaves learning partnerships to tackle pressing questions that challenge humanitarian development and peace-building efforts today and into the future. Ruth has over 20 years of experience in development and peace-building and has worked in over 30 countries from Somalia to Myanmar, designing and leading programs that build on community resilience in the face of social, political, and environmental systems-level challenges. She previously worked at Mercy Corps as our Director of Governance and Partnerships and founded Viewfinder International. Thank you. Peter Bentley, right there at the end, is the head of the Adaptation and Resilience team at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. This team covers the policy and central programmes on international adaptation and resilience for the UK, as well as the UNFCCC adaptation and loss and damage negotiations. He previously led on disaster risk financing and insurance for FCDO and helped set up the Centre of Disaster Protection. Prior to this role, he worked in humanitarian response for Save the Children, working across East Africa in South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia. My colleague, Olga Petroniak, who is our Senior Director of Resilience in Africa. Olga is an inclusive, impact-orientated senior leader with over 20 years of experience designing, delivering and growing high-value, high-impact programming at the intersect of climate change, adaptation, food and water systems, market development, and good governance. We're also joined by David Abudo. David is a climate justice advocacy advisor for Oxfam International and also the climate justice lead for Oxfam Africa. Working across more than 24 countries in Africa, David has been working in the civil space for 20 years, championing the rights of communities vulnerable to the climate crisis. Thank you, David. And last but not least, we are joined by Bharati Chaturvedi, who is the founder of Chintan, the Environmental and Research Action Group. Jinton is best known for its work on waste, air pollution and climate change, with collective action at its centre. Jinton undertakes cross-cutting research for informing policy and environmental cooperation. Bharati was also the winner of the first ever Innovation Award for Empowerment of Women and Girls and the 2009 Johns Hopkins Knowledge of the World Award. Thank you, everyone. Okay, amazing. We're going to dive straight into questions. I'll start with you, if that's okay. Given your vantage point, what do you think that donors or implementers often get wrong when trying to untangle climate and conflict dynamics? And how does governance show up or not show up in these considerations?
Thanks so much for the question, Anna, and thanks for organizing the panel. Please come on in, have a seat. We're just getting started. And hello to everyone who's also on the live stream or watching this after it's been recorded. We're going to actually start out with a quick poll, and it'll start to answer the question. Okay, so if you were forced, people in the audience and also looking to people on the panel, if you were forced to say, I'm a governance person, a peace person, or a climate person, how many people would say, you can't choose more than one, how many people would say, I'm a governance person?
Just you.
How many people would say, I'm a peace person? How many people would say, I'm a climate person? Okay. And how many people would say, if you weren't forced to say one, how many people would say all three? How many people would say at least two of those? All right. So it's good to know that this is a group of systems thinkers. And that's where we're getting started today, because I think one of the failures that we see as CDA through our research in everywhere from coastal Fiji with displaced people to the Peruvian Amazon with indigenous women to the United States, where history of erasure during the US gold rush meant that indigenous people lost their rights. We see the intersection of these issues everywhere we look. And community members don't think as governance silos, as peace silos, as climate silos. They think about their families. They think about nature and their relationship with resources. They think about the changes that are happening. And so why should climate finance, why should good governance issues, why should interventions of peace building not also be climate interventions, not also be things that help us support social cohesion and the foundational elements of good governance? This is something that we're trying to understand how to reverse engineer some of the silos that keep us separated. And doing so means we have to stop thinking about just the policy solutions and the top-down interventions, but listening deeply to communities to say, what is your definition of resilience? How can governance be a part of that? How can peace building be a part of that? How can climate adaptations be a part of that? And how can they each work together? So thinking about, instead of simplifying these complex issues, appreciating that they are complex. They have to be. Communities understand the complexities. Communities sit with the complexities. Our work, whether it's climate finance or governance interventions or peace building interventions, has to embrace that complexity too and be led by communities. So I'll pause there, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the specifics as we go further.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'll move on to Olga. Olga, Mercy Corps has worked at the intersection of climate, conflict and fragility for over a decade. It would be great to hear from you what lessons you've learned over that time and what challenges still remain. We're in the lucky position that you have been at Mercy Corps for a while, so you have lots of institutional memory that you can share with us.
Thanks for the reminder. Thanks so much, Anna, and thanks so much, Ruth. That was a really difficult question to answer, precisely because Mercy Corps is a multi-mandate organization. So we work across to deliver and enhance access to humanitarian aid, economic development, and peace assistance to support communities to meet their full range of needs and aspirations, help them to cope and adapt and thrive, and ultimately emerge from the global crises, including climate change. And I just wanted to also emphasize that we really partner with those who are most marginalized, have the least access to services, those that are really at risk of extreme poverty or are already in poverty. And these are the communities that, as Ruth mentioned and Anna mentioned, these are least responsible for the global crisis, global climate crisis, but really bear the disproportionate burden. And this is where we've seen only 2.1% of climate finance going into these contexts. So in terms of what we've learned, I'd like to focus on the African continent, which is the focus of my work, and where we work in 13 out of the 18 countries that are characterized as conflict affected by the World Bank. And again, this is where the climate crisis is playing out today, causing massive displacement, upending people's ability to make a living, and really playing out on a day-to-day basis. So I think the first thing we've learned, and this lesson came actually just over a decade ago, is that investing in peace and good governance actions actually helps communities cope with the climate crises and events that are in front of them. And I'd like to take you guys back actually to the 2011 and 2012 Horn of Africa drought, which affected 10 million people across Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia. This was kind of a big moment of reckoning for the international donor community at the time, because they saw that investing millions of dollars in development without a focus on adaptation could basically undermine all those gains when a major crisis like the drought struck. And at this time, you saw people's entire livelihoods completely decimated. Interestingly, we were working on a peace building program in Ethiopia at that time that had nothing to do really with drought resilience. That wasn't the focus of the program at all. The country faced border conflicts where essentially administrative lines, boundaries were drawn along ethnic lines. There was a lot of cross-border conflicts. And particularly this affected communities who were reliant on livestock. These boundaries affected their grazing pattern, their access to water and pasture. So as the devastation of the drought was playing out around us, we began to hear anecdotally from the communities who were participants in our peace and good governance interventions, oh no, actually we're okay. We're able to negotiate with our neighbors, in the other community to be able to access the market or able to access resources. And we ended up taking all these anecdotes and did a quantitative study. And it was our first empirical piece of research that actually demonstrated that communities who had access to these peace and good governance interventions had greater freedom of movement and access to resources than comparison groups, number one. And two, those that had that greater for freedom of movement and access to resources were less likely to engage in negative coping strategies during the drought. Fast forward another decade, we just saw the 2021 to 2023 drought playing out across the Horn of Africa, 36 million people affected. And again, we noticed that even within countries, even within a country like Ethiopia, those regions that have the greatest amount of institutional fragility are those where people are least likely to be able to cope with the disaster. So over that decade, we began to then not just look at coping, but how could we support communities, partner with them to ensure that they were less affected by future disasters. And what we really began to pay attention to is how a deficit in peace and good governance fundamentally affected those long-term adaptation actions, both through direct causes, but also through downstream effects. And of course, perhaps in retrospect, the link is quite obvious, but it was rarely talked about, and we can take a simple example of like land governance, right? Where people don't have land tenure insecurity, where they don't have clear land titles, where zones aren't clearly demarcated. what would be their incentive to invest, say, in regenerative agriculture, which takes 4, 5, 6 years to yield on a return on investment, where they don't know if, as somebody who's a sharecropper or who's borrowing land, if they're going to have that, if that land even in a couple months. And I think the downstream effects also became very clear. One of the things that we learned from our teams, and Anna mentioned to it, is like when places are labeled as fragile, they are not receiving the finance, but they're not receiving the finance, so they're also not receiving access to technology. They have less information. They have limited private sector engagement in these areas. So this all affects climate adaptation actions. 2 more points, if you bear with me. The third thing that we began to learn and that came into stark relief with the communities that we were working with on the ground is that a deficit in peace and good governance, coupled with extreme exposure to climate change, really creates a negative feedback loop, where those communities that are most exposed to fragility and conflict are most climate affected, and that contributes to more conflict. And I'll just give an example, actually, from our FCDO-funded Justice and Stability Program, JAS, in the Sahel, where we did an assessment that found that systemic failure in rainfall or erratic rainfall doesn't have to be a drought. The unpredictability of rainfall is increasing and causing conflict almost on every single level. Intra-household dynamics, greater strain in familiar relationships, intra-family dynamics, where there's increased competition over scarce land because land is less productive and yields are less certain. And of course, inter-community conflict across farmers, but also across farming and herding communities. I think the really important thing to note, though, is that we often think of this as a community-to-community conflict, but what we were also seeing from our assessments in the Sahel is that when communities were not supported by climate adaptation actions, they ultimately increased their grievances towards their state. They found that the state was essentially failing them because it could not provide them with basic services to help them adapt. And so this kind of breaks down the society-state relationships, and this is where you start seeing potentially people joining armed groups, et cetera. And again, this came out from some of our assessments in the JAS program, where people basically said that, we're supposed to have land commissions in these areas that are supposed to help us resolve these issues, but they're not funded. We don't see them present. Or as people had to go to use the court system, for example, to help resolve disputes, they said, the court system is only for the wealthy. Those are only the people that benefit from it. So some of these things clearly came out. I think the fourth and final point, and last one, if you'll bear with me, is that we're learning that there are a lot of things that we can do to address these dynamics, and that we do have to do 2 things at once, which is to actively promote peace and good governance and climate change adaptation. And there are things that work. So for example, again, to use the example of JAS, we're partnering with both communities and government to help reform and increase access to land commissions, specifically working to make these more inclusive of women and youth, ensure that communities feel more represented by these institutions. More broadly, facilitating kind of community-driven peace processes aimed at strengthening social cohesion at multiple levels. But importantly, these are coupled with adaptation measures. So we're working to provide market access to climate resilient inputs, working with the private sector to increase access to feed and fodder, working with the government on landscape level restoration measure and providing access to technologies. So coupling these governance actions with some of the adaptation measures, we're seeing that not only is this reducing grievances and conflicts, but reinstating sort of a faith in state-based institutions, enabling access to services and promoting long-term adaptation. I'll stop there, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. That's fantastic. David, a very similar question for you. It'd be great to hear from you about some of the programs that Oxfam has been implementing. They have really been a sort of leading voice in this area. And yeah, we'd love to know what lessons you have learned from Oxfam's climate adaptation programming over the years.
Thank you. That's a very useful question. But maybe for the benefit of the audience, including those who are joining us online, it would be good to just to bring you up to speed about what Oxfam does in the world. Many of you may be aware of our humanitarian facet of work. Oxfam started as a humanitarian organization in the 40s. And to that extent, we still support communities in fragile contexts throughout the world. But broadly, right now, based on the influencing and programming work that we do, we see ourselves as a movement of people in at least 90 countries fighting poverty and working together to beat inequality. And so in that sense, many of you who've been following the COP deliberation, from the opening ceremony you heard about Secretary General quoting one of the seminal reports that Oxfam has produced, Inequality Kills report. That shows you some of the work that Oxfam does. Oxfam is at the forefront of generating knowledge products that really speak to the issues that are relevant in this space, linking climate justice work, linking humanitarian work, linking issues within the just economy space, and also governance issue, because if we take the systems approach, all these issues are connected, and that is the approach that we bring to our work. Within the space of Africa, and I'll speak more specifically on adaptation, our work with countries in about 24 countries that we have a presence really helps to connect decision makers with the policy spaces that are important, in the sense that if you look at adaptation governance, the primary issue is the involvement of voices, community voices, involvement of other stakeholders to come up with policies and laws and frameworks that really speak to adaptation. In the context of COP, for example, we know that adaptation has not reached the political elevation that mitigation, or for example, campaign to lower temperature to 1.5 degrees has reached. So we are pushing for narratives that elevates this. And specifically, again, looking at adaptation in the context of commitment to double adaptation financing, looking at that space, we have been engaging with leadership across Africa at the national level and a subnational level to ensure that the policies, the governance structures that they come up with actually builds not only the knowledge and awareness base of communities so that we move along with everyone, but also increases the absorptive capacity. Because if we talk about financing and you look at subnational level, you realize that at the subnational level, many instances, in many contexts, although they have the laws, like for example, the Climate Change National Adaptation Strategy of South Africa, or the National Adaptation Strategy of Ghana, or even Kenya. One of the findings from our implementation is that the absorptive capacity and the capacity to engage more broadly at the subnational level is still missing. So that's a missing link that we try to link up with in our programming. But the other important point to note is that within the adaptation space, most of communities and stakeholders are not aware of what adaptation is, in the sense that when one of the surveys that we did asked people between adaptation and climate finance what they've understood or what their sense of it is, that majority could not relate adaptation to the climate crisis happening in their context. That is at community level. And that shows you that there's a communication gap. So broadly, if you look at implementation, governance, there could be policies, there could be laws that are in place, but in reality, there's a disconnect between the laws and the practice and the involvement and inclusion of communities in the wider adaptation discourse that's ongoing. Finally, the other point to note is that within the COP space that we are in right now, there are calls, for example, to finalize the UAE Belém framework, to have tangible goals on tangible indicators on adaptation. But the most important thing is that let us push so that this doesn't become another reporting mechanism. Let us focus on, building a process, not only the quantum, not only the metrics that will come out of it, but let us put fidelity to the entire process so that we truly move communities with us in this discourse. A lot of times from these discussion spaces, technical people will input into the text and beautiful write-ups will come out. But the reality of it is that translating this and also contributing to the wider systemic change around, the architecture to deliver the financing, for example, around the governance, from the global to the lower level. Those are issues that we need to speak up to. So we will make beautiful, technical input into, what should be included in the text and what not. But the reality is that there's got to be a way in which everything connects to the grassroots. I'll stop there, but happy to continue with this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm wondering, just before we move on to Bharati, because it's so interesting to hear you talk about sort of building those governance structures from the community level up and working with them to identify needs and policy gaps. I'd love to hear about maybe an example for some of Oxfam's programs where that's been particularly successful, or on the opposite, whether you could talk about an example that maybe encountered certain barriers and how you managed to overcome them.
Thank you. That's a very important question. I will give you two examples. So one of the programs we are doing, it's called Together Against Poverty, and we are working with in at least 5 countries across Africa, from Ghana to Somalia, Ethiopia, and back to Nigeria. One of the lessons, one of the takeaways is that although we support countries and partners to input into the laws and the frameworks that are in place, the reality of those engagements, and this is a negative, but nonetheless a lesson we've learned, is that adaptation has not received the attention that it deserves. That adaptation, because adaptation is usually locally led and is highly context specific, the global impetus and the global push that it requires to elevate the narrative is still missing. And so there's that piecemeal approach to adaptation, which we really need to help to build a narrative that connects everything. So that's a major lesson from our programming. The other important lesson is in terms of leadership. The African group of negotiators, for example, they have an important role to play in elevating adaptation. And if you look at their text, for example, they want to land adaptation under NCQG, right, as a sub-goal. And they're talking of about 300 billion. Those conversations need to be elevated. Even gender perspective in adaptation, those are areas that we've learned that we really need to bring up. And so my quick take home is that the role of leadership, and especially leadership that connects and unifies Africa's voices. Africa's voices are still disparate, they're still disjointed. We need to unify them, but we also need to place a bigger role on the African group of negotiators to really push their position on adaptation. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, David. I'll go to Bharati next, if that's all right. Bharati, hi. We often refer to fragile and conflict-affected settings as sort of a big homogenous group, but we know that fragility is a spectrum, and actually in many of the countries that you work, they have no active conflict or even a recent history of conflict in some cases, but they do experience high social and economic fragility and are extremely climate vulnerable. Can you talk about some of the approaches that you use in these contexts to counter climate risks?
Well, thank you for that. Our work is restricted to South Asia, basically, but it's a very interesting thing because South Asia has huge, just like Africa, it's got a whole range of vulnerabilities which are playing out. So whether you look at drought, which is there, say, in west of India, whether you look at floods where you have large parts of the Himalayas as well as the Indus Basin in Pakistan, whether you look at just increasing cyclones in the west, in the east, which is basically Bangladesh and East India. So there's a lot happening there. And what strikes me is there are three kinds of things that are happening. One of them is actually communities coming together, realizing just from lived experience that you do have to act together. And it's not that both are necessarily beneficiaries. For example, in Nepal, communities that are upstream of India are actually, they don't stand to benefit, but they use WhatsApp. And this is how people use technology. So they're using WhatsApp to warn people living downstream about when the river is looking a little flooded, or when they have heard that there's a lot of water coming down. So what happens to the people downstream is they get to know and they can kind of evacuate, even though they'll probably lose everything, but they can evacuate. And many of these communities, you can't tell them, oh, just don't live here, because their whole interrelationship with ecology, with rivers, with river systems, with the way their livelihoods work, are all embedded in nature. So they just cannot be told to live somewhere else. They just don't have that kind of perspective about how they would like to live, and they wouldn't like to be kind of forced away from an ecosystem in which they themselves see their work and their lives as a part of. But then you have, so I think things like that should be really acknowledged, but also strengthened. For example, what else could you do with training people who are giving these early warnings, which is a community-based early warning system? What would they want more? Would they want yet an earlier warning so that they can convey that? So we need to find ways that work for communities. And then there's a more government-to-government thing, China, for example, we have this river Brahmaputra. It's this one of the most ferocious large rivers coming from China, huge river coming into India and flooding very often. And it used to be called the River of Sorrow just because people didn't understand that a lot of floods in South Asia are actually part of how the river behaves always. But more importantly, it caused a lot of harm, particularly to the poor. And what China has done, and China is a country that does have, a particularly, a tense relationship with India over border issues and about territorial. I think India is not the only country it has that relationship with, but we are right next door. So what they've done is pretty astounding with the Brahmaputra River. Every day an email goes out with just one piece of data to the Indian government from the Chinese government, which basically tells you what is the water level. Nothing more, nothing less. And you look at this data and you take a call on whether you should worry or not, because you already have the science available. But just with that, and it's a kind of, I believe, I understand, although I have no way to verify this, that it's kind of automated. So in that sense, it's kind of almost immunized from everyday fluctuations in that relationship. Having said that, it did stop for a couple of years when the worst, low-grade warfare was happening. But it's back now, and that also, then the Indian government will send it out to the districts that are vulnerable, and so on. And I then will move to air, as I don't know how many of you know this, but even Dr. Maria Naira 3 days ago, in a press conference held up Delhi's air pollution data and said that it was something like, the WHO standard is 5, just to make it really easy. And Delhi was breathing 400 particulate matter 2.5, which is one of the most toxic sizes of air that you can breathe. It goes straight through your blood barrier into your body, causing heart attacks and strokes and so on. It's really, really been catastrophic. in India, we've never seen something like this. However, 2 weeks ago, Lahore looked like this. And we were watching and saying, what happened? And one of the things that has been happening for a while is technical people coming together and saying, we're losing lives every single day because of this air pollution. So what can we do? And right there in 2018, for example, technical people who measure data from India and Pakistan actually managed to speak with each other and figure out how do you finesse measuring and low-cost monitoring. And this is really important. If you don't monitor, you don't know how bad things are in which particular area. And I think there's a lot more conversation. Currently, there's a conversation, I'm also a part of it, where what we're trying to do is saying, okay, relationships, there's no active war or anything, but it is a slightly a fraught relationship, I would say, and it has been for nearly 80 years. Oh my God.
Peter, are you okay? We're coming to you next.
Yeah, well, I shifted. I think India, Pakistan kind of toppled you, right? Yeah. So we're saying, okay, there's so much information and learning. Just for example, India's electric mobility policy that's rolling out, that's quite amazing at that scale. How do you put all that down, say, in a portal that people can access, whether or not they're part of this small conversational group? But having said all that, you do need to invest in these kinds of groups, because you do need to invest in multiple conversations, because only then do you create a safe space. Everybody is not a community in the traditional social way. So you do need to create safe space to give out more data, to share what works, what doesn't work. And I would think even things like India put a $4 billion credit line to Sri Lanka when it had its big economic crisis, from which one hopes it is recovering now. I mean, many people did stuff, but a lot of that was that economic crisis wasn't just like an economic crisis. I mean, it was backstopped by a climate change impact, some kind of. So some of that money would build resilience, and if one did shift looking at that kind of funding through as an emergencies, as relief, I think we need to shift that relief paradigm into adaptation, which is that we're giving you money, sure. I mean, I know apart from that money, milk powder was sent because there were all these babies and there was a massive crisis about them. But how do you look at adaptation beyond that? Should we plant, what should we plant? Should we do mangroves so that if there's a cyclone, people don't have to throw this kind of money into relief, but in fact have already pre-spent it. So I will conclude by suggesting that sometimes without active conflict, and just with slightly fraught relationships, communities still act, and it's important to understand what else they need to, build up and muscle up their impact. And there's lots more investment needed in smaller things like trust building, like knowledge, and things like that, so that communities are not hindered in the way that they're supporting each other through adaptation. In fact, we also need to inject adaptation in relief.
Brilliant, thank you. You okay?
I'm good.
Okay, good. So, as a donor, FCDO has been very forward-leaning in this space. How are you considering the impacts of conflict and fragility as a driver of climate vulnerability? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities that you see for donors like FCDO in this work?
Great, thank you. So we've been leaning in kind of in the space quite a lot over the last few years. We were heavily involved in the COP28 declaration on climate relief and recovery and peace. And then this year, we've been working very closely with the Azerbaijan presidency around the creation of the Baku hub, and then also the principles which we've talked about. And so, climate conflict and instability play huge roles around kind of exacerbating and as risk multipliers, and then combining that with climate becomes hugely problematic. So a couple of weeks ago I was in Chad, and you've got kind of political refugees coming through from Sudan, and then they're struggling now in areas that are hugely affected by climate. So you've got real challenges now where in many ways they're now having to move around because of climate where they were, or partially because of climate. So now you've got climate refugees, and there's not to point about kind of voting for what do you work on. They're not climate refugees, not political, they're just refugees, but they are experiencing challenges as a result of all of these things. And we need to consider how best kind of to engage with them, and support them on kind of better lives and enable them to thrive. I think kind of things like the Baku hub, the Baku call rather, and under which is kind of the Baku hub and the principles are really helping kind of get this political momentum behind this group, because as talked about, Anna talks about the amount of funding flowing to these spaces is so small to the kind of more what we call fragile states, compared to kind of more stable countries, and part of that is an access to finance thing. I mean, they don't often have the capacity to bid into things like the Green Climate Fund and accessing other funds, so they're still getting this traditional humanitarian funding, but because of their conflict and instability, they're not accessing this longer term resilient financing for resilience that enables them to sort of, we always say transition, which is a little unhelpful phrase, but kind of, so a WFP project, for example, in Chad, where they're bidding for money to move away from food distributions to actually doing long-term leasing of land, so 5, 10, 20 years, regenerating that land and actually supporting the refugees to actually work on the land, grow crops, which creates a private sector and markets, but also kind of much more long-term resilience. I mean, trucking food into southeast Chad is just a logistical nightmare. It takes 45 days sometimes to truck it in, and just doesn't really work in the long term for anyone. What the call and the principles are trying to do is showing kind of, as we look at channeling more climate finance into this kind of space, is actually what does that mean in practice? How can we sort of taking a more risk-based approach and being aware that actually sometimes it does cost more to work in these contexts, and actually finding long-term ways of sort of delivering it in a way that works, and where possible is government owned. So kind of coming back to this kind of governance piece. So not just governments, but kind of within the departments. So we talk to the Ministry of Environment, but often they're not connected well to the Minister of Finance, and all these different departments often don't speak well to each other. And to be clear, this is hard even in the UK. So I work closely on our National Adaptation Plan, and actually it's owned by our Department for Environment, which doesn't always have the levers that, say, our Cabinet Office would have. So how do you kind of support the governance within a government, but also within other delivery actors, and actually have that, so like you're channeling the money to where it's most effectively used. So what we talk about sometimes is this idea that kind of it's not just the amount of funding, it's not just what you're funding, but it's how you're funding, it's who that money is going to. So ODI actually did some research around, often the funders will go through, and they do a great job, so the Oxfams, the WFPs and others, but often it's because it's such weak systems within the governments. But the issue is you're then also never strengthening those systems. So then you have a negative multiplier effect kind of thing of the conflict and fragility. Fragility and then exacerbated by conflict is that actually, you've got weak systems and then no one works with those systems, and so they stay weak. But again, that's also hugely challenging. My government sometimes won't necessarily work with the government directly, or be reticent about working with directly because of that conflict and because of the legitimacy of governments and things. And so each context can be really different. There's real opportunities in places like Chad, which actually has a stable government, to work directly with them, whereas others like Syria, for example, it would be a different situation. So you can't lumping all these countries together and saying, yeah, climate finance is great and more must flow. So because there is a real opportunity there, but as I said, there's also those real challenges that we need to work through. locally led up for adaptation, which is becoming a real buzzword, and it's a buzz phrase, which is great. And there are real opportunities with locally led, but again, it's how are you plugging into the kind of bigger systems? So in Bangladesh, we're working with local communities, but we're also being really clear that the mayor and others are involved in that decision making. So there's real ownership by the kind of local governments, but also kind of the governments between the two of really local level sort of chieftains or heads or women leaders or whatever they are, and the mayors, and then the kind of regional governments. So it's that kind of ownership. So we're not just sort of coming in and undermining, but also we're encouraging what they don't, sometimes these systems that they don't always necessarily do. And then just on your point on kind of the global goal and adaptation, yeah, we totally see kind of, we need to make sure that any new structures and systems we're creating there and indicators, they are incentivizing improved governance, incentivizing better action, and it's not just kind of measuring outputs, or worst case, measuring just inputs. So a huge finance target we're very against within the global goal and adaptation, but also that the outputs we're measuring aren't just sort of delivering X and Y on the ground. It's like, how are they delivering that in a long-term way that's government-owned, that utilizes the resources available, and if possible, strengthens kind of that long-term piece. Thanks.
Thank you. That's really useful, and I think yourself and Ruth have mentioned this sort of siloed, maybe not siloed thinking, but siloed structures that make it difficult to address these things simultaneously. I mean, we've identified some of the challenges, but it'd be great to hear from you, Peter, and then also maybe you, Ruth, about how we can shift this siloed thinking and funding streams, and how, we can fund things that are working across this intersection.
Yeah, so that's things like the Baku Call and the Declaration, the principles. I mean, that's what we're trying to do as kind of a donor community and working with the developing countries. And we talk about transboundary risks quite a lot and things, and it's how we are moving away from this kind of projectized, because there is a role for projects, and there is a role for country-based interventions, but actually it's trying to also look at kind of the risk. So if the risk is a water system, how are we addressing the water system challenge? Not just kind of country X has a bit of a problem with the river, the parts of the river that flows through their country, or within the river basin and things. But it is hugely challenging. That coordination is really, really difficult, and it's just being really kind of honest with each other, being honest with donors and getting that feedback around how we actually can work best together. But I mean, this has been a problem forever, right? Like, this is sort of overall coordination, even within NGOs. When I used to work for Save the Children, obviously, fighting for resources for each disaster and things, like, not fighting, to gentle competition, and actually doing proper needs-based analysis and things. And if you can help, if we're in countries where the governance is better, it's much easier because you can work with the government and you can sort of make it clear that you don't do things that kind of work well for them. But within conflict states, or just fragile states, not even conflict, as you said, like, there's lots of fragile states without conflict. It's much harder just because they don't have that kind of reach, and it's a kind of, I think it's a role for all of us to make sure you're not undermining those and damaging those, and actually sort of saying, actually, this is what we'll work together as much as is feasibly possible. But I'm afraid I don't have a clear, straightforward solution to that.
No,
Otherwise,
that's useful.
probably be much more senior than I was.
Thank you. I think Ruth had something that you wanted to add to that. Yeah. Sorry, guys. Pass the mic down. Thank you.
This is a large panel, and it's a lot of fun to have all the different perspectives. Do you mind if I put this here? I don't know how to do this.
I can hold it.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate where the conversation has started to go, where we're thinking outside the box of just government. I mean, this panel has governance in the title, and governance indicates the relationship between different types of structures, both civil society and official and indigenous, local, all the different, informal sometimes is used. I think that if we are only talking about formal elected structures of national government or even subnational and local government, we're missing a huge set of opportunities. And so if we think about what locally led adaptation needs and how to think systemically, there are a million right answers that live outside of formal government structures. And so listening to how indigenous leaders and indigenous ways of knowing, for example, are thinking about resources beyond finance, beyond monetary numbers, and understanding some of the trust-based resource exchange, the cultural ways of sharing resources, sharing wealth, sharing collective wisdom, thinking about, it sounds very very nice, but what we understand is that innovation comes from all of those right answers, and that it's our job to think outside of our own silos and frames and conventions and policies and whatnot, into being curious, bringing more curiosity into our exchange. And this is really what we're doing at CDA is we're a very small research INGO. We're working with Mercy Corps, with Oxfam, with a lot of local organizations around the world to say, what are the ideas and how do we bring those into the mainstream of action? And this is kind of gets to the other point I wanted to raise, just to your question, is the formal mechanisms, and CDA endorsed the principles. We stand behind the Baku Hub and the Baku Call. How do we make sure that there are do no harm parameters around those mechanisms? That we're not just thinking about the potential for those spaces, but really interrogating how could this go wrong, and how do we move away from that? How do we build on local capacities for peace? And that takes deep listening. So just the positive idea of lots of good answers, and also the cautionary tale of do no harm guardrails.
Thank you, Ruth. It's really interesting to hear both you and Peter talk about the sort of subnational governance as opposed to governments, and also I think we've mentioned maybe traditional leaders or religious groups and sort of those models of governance as well. It would be great to hear from the panel about how you are working to ensure that marginalized communities and identities are being substantially brought into those decision-making structures, if you are working within, those traditional structures, or trying to build them from scratch, as David was talking about. I don't know if anyone has anything they'd like to say on that over the mic.
Thank you. Just to chime in on that, I think for us, what seems to be working, because it's work in progress, is engaging frontline communities, and including marginalized communities, in people's NDCs, nationally determined contributions, which in simple terms is the climate commitments, the commitments of each country to realizing the Paris goal, around climate change, the commitments, and it's sector-wide. So that space, a lot of times, and in many contexts across Africa especially, marginalized communities do not have the levers to maneuver and access them. And so Oxfam, through our partners, we try to help connect them in the sense of framing issues in a language they understand. So the textual framing of issues to widen the engagement. Issues of accessibility of marginalized communities to these spaces. So sometimes we take the dialogue to them, so that the issues are well captured and then channeled appropriately. So for us, what has worked in terms of working with marginalized communities is really focusing on people's NDCs, people-led process that really is truly inclusive and gives meaning to participation in that, literal sense of that word. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
It's all right. We've got loads of time. You can all
Yeah,
have a
just
go.
really briefly, I'd love to share an example of working with Dalit women waste pickers in the Delhi region. It's called the National Capital Region, has multiple municipalities, and many, through a whole iterative process and capacity and conversation and dialogue, what came out was when they said, okay, so what happens in our real life. We're still leading that life where we don't have water and things like that because they live in slums. So one of the things we rolled out was we picked up 30 women. We gave them a little bit of help, which was a financial stipend. We put them through a long training, about 4 months, which is very long for women like that, at a time and everything as decided by each community. And then they went out and did advocacy around adaptation. And they decided what they wanted. So the results were quite extraordinary. For the first time in decades, they've got water lines and things like that. They've got sewage pipes. They finally got access to social security, which transforms how much money they spend when it's hot and then people get ill. So I thought I'd just share that because that was their understanding of how they wanted to protect themselves. And I'm talking of about 17,000 people.
Thank you. Olga?
Yeah, maybe just to add very quickly, and to build on the points that Peter and Ruth made, that in contexts where, formal government is considered, not as legitimate, weak, maybe there's fragility in institutions, we know that communities have ultimate form of governance, are ultimate forms of legitimacy, and we very much work with and engage with those structures. But I think we have to also recognize that those structures themselves are often plagued by inequality, hierarchies, historical patriarchies. And so we do work with those traditional institutions and support them through community-led processes to reflect and reform. And this is a lot of the work that we've done in terms of looking at how women, young people can be more included in some of these decision-making bodies, which is really critical. But we also have to remember we don't want to ignore the state, and we don't want to, work with parallel structures and ignore the state, because that can also kind of increase these cycles of fragility. And so a lot of what we do is support through some of our, inclusive governance processes is to help communities organize to be able to advocate to the state for the budget, for the funding, and for the actions that they need to support their local adaptation efforts. So it's both, supporting local structures to be more inclusive, more also responsive to their own constituents' needs, and then driving that partnership with formal government structures. And we find that that's probably, the most effective way forward.
If I could just add to what Olga just said, I think that this is exactly the right approach, right? And we know that you don't want to undermine the state. You don't want to legitimize groups that are perpetuating patriarchies or other marginalization. This is where systems approaches and how to demystify that complexity and working with communities to have accessible ways to understand relationships, understand opportunities, surface options that don't harm or perpetuate the challenges, but actually start to break some of the cycles that keep us stuck. And so building with all of you as practitioners, as people who care about these issues and think systemically, is exactly what we're trying to do, to build things that are very accessible for people to be able to surface those options and be creative and find ways to break the cycles.
Thank you, Ruth. And everyone, that was really... Olga, I hope to come back to what you were saying and just programs and how you're approaching governance challenges and climate adaptation. How does that play out differently in contexts where there is high intensity conflict in comparison to contexts where perhaps there is low levels of social cohesion?
Wasn't expecting that.
Sorry.
I mean, I think there is, just one is that we have to recognize that we can't paint, and I think this has come up from the panel, fragile and conflict affected states or even a single state with a broad brush, right? Even in places that are highly affected by conflict, there are relative pockets of stability, and even places that are in active war zones. People are relying on markets. People are relying on their social networks to get by. So I think there's an opportunity to look both at coping with the dual and simultaneous effects of climate and conflict and adaptation measures, even in those places where it seems, where everything is broken, like context in Sudan. I would say that even there, we're able to work with market actors to look at how to get more climate resilient and climate adaptive seeds through market actors into areas where, humanitarians cannot go. And we see opportunities to embed adaptation measures even within our relief work. That being said, I think where there is latent conflict, where things are more stable, you can take a much more long-term view. And where you have the opportunity to look at climate data, you have ability to bring in early warning systems, and you have the ability to strengthen those relationships across state and non-state actors. I would say that is much harder to do, or almost impossible to do, in places that where the state is a party to an active conflict. This is where we really need to work with private sector and more local and decentralized institutions. In other places, I think are opportunities to still rebuild and restore those relationships and support the state to provide more effective services in terms of adaptation, while also partnering with those community structures and ensuring that adaptation measures are locally led.
Amazing, thank you. I'm wondering if I could go back to you. You've been involved in the UNFCCC process for a number of years, and this is as COP. A lot of funding is going to be released hopefully from the new NCQG. What are you hoping to see at COP this year, and how will you use some of that finance to further this work, despite the fact it's not a negotiated item?
Sorry, I missed a tiny little bit. What when you say the NCQG, but what when you say what's not a negotiated item? Sorry.
The topic we're speaking about today isn't a negotiated item, but we are going to have a sort of a new goal and climate finance coming. Yeah.
So I mean, within the NCQG, so the UK is pushing for an ambitious number. I think releasing funds is possibly not the quite right term that we would use. So the committing of the funds and things. And within the GCF, within the NCQG, like we have, the UK has long sort of said that we want more kind of targeted for LDC specifically, and also for SIDS. And just a bit of concern that's kind of a bit, and although adaptation is a global good, like we're not suggesting that middle income countries shouldn't have a share of adaptation finance and things. So I suppose what we need to do is make sure that the system is kind of talking or is aligned. So what you don't want to have is the negotiations just being this complete standalone piece where the NCQG looks like one thing, and then but we're talking about more funding flowing to fragile states. We're talking about we're as co-chair of the GCF, we've worked really closely, kind of partly we put $2 billion into it, half of which will go to adaptation, half to mitigation. And we've been pushing for kind of better funding for LDCs. We were a big part of this influencing the GCF and for this £100 million grant that will go to Somalia. And also, whilst at COP, they've committed money to Iraq. We're trying to get Chad kind of to talk more directly to the GCF. And so what we want to see is within the we've got the negotiation space, you've got the global goal and adaptation, you've got the NCQG, and we just need to make sure that the negotiation space and the real world delivery of that do look kind of comparable, and that we're not sort of having these big political decision making happening in the negotiation space that then ultimately still doesn't increase the flows down to kind of the LDCs and the fragile states, and even the SIDS, and their vulnerability kind of thing. We need to be really clear that often a lot of SIDS which are not fragile today overnight can overnight become massively vulnerable. Well, they are massively vulnerable, but can fragile so quickly. And so actually, how are we making sure that countries that are not currently fragile but are super vulnerable, how are we increasing that resilience so that ultimately we don't lose lives, we don't lose livelihoods, and and even just to put a really blunt point, it's just better value for money to do it that way. It's cheaper. So rather than putting that money in up front, rather than having to do humanitarian, not least the moral implications of all of that, and so making sure those two parts of the system are working together. But also noting, again, I just keep saying it's really challenging, but within the NTQG, there's a huge concern around the role of the private sector, like what money should be counted within the NTQG versus kind of what was quite a blunt instrument with the 100 billion. But within that, we lobbied at COP26 for people to double their climate adaptation finances to really kind of drive them towards this 100 billion. So we want to set up an NTQG that really kind of works for all parties, that's realistic, but actually kind of can be held properly to account. Because I think our concern is that there was going to be a totemic there was a push for a totemic number, but that was never going to be reached, and so actually that's almost unhelpful, because then you sort of just everybody's frustrated with the process then. So we want to see something that kind of both incentivizes but is ambitious, of course, but achievable.
Thank you, that's great. And yes, ambition is the word of COP, I feel, this year. I wanted to pause briefly in case anyone in the audience had a question that they would like to ask any of our panelists. If not, that's absolutely fine, but feel free to raise your hand and I will come to you. I'm aware of time, so what I'd love to do is go back to each of our panelists and just hear from you about if you wanted the audience to take away one thing from this conversation, or perhaps if you've heard something another person has said and you think that's going to stick with me, what would that be? David, you've got the mic. Please start us off.
Very important. I want to build on the last point that Peter meant, that really it's not the quantum. As Oxfam, we have a very ambitious quantum, including a moral framing of climate debt and historical reparation to the tune of 5 trillion. But it's really not about the quantum. It's about the process, the fidelity of the process, and ensuring that those commitments can be fulfilled. Specifically for adaptation, there was that earlier commitment of doubling adaptation financing. We'd like that to be realized. And also, like I mentioned, the other takeaway point is that if we finalize the UAE Berlin framework and we come up with those indicators, let it not just be for measuring. Let us actualize their implementation. So it's not, we don't want another additional monitoring tool. So that's my takeaway point. Yes.
Amazing. Should we go down that way and then back
This
up
way.
this way? Yeah.
You sort of stole my point there, David. So stole it. You said it better than I was going to say it. So yeah, again, I just think it's the kind of how are we delivering this finance in such a way, like, the finance, if we have finance flowing into programs and things, it will have an impact. But what channels are we using, what systems are we using, the cost of delivering that finance, be through directly to waste kind of collectors on the ground where you're sort of talking, versus kind of putting the money through GCF and things that goes in at a government level versus sort of deliverable levels, like being really mindful about the method of delivery. And again, not just about the quantum, although the quantum is, without a decent figure and that's the amount of money flowing, the mechanism is irrelevant. But yeah, that mechanism of delivery is just so critical. Otherwise, we sort of, it should be a win-win on those two fronts, and it risks you sort of, ineffective, inefficient programming, which is just, given the finite resources we have, just completely inexcusable to be spending climate finance in that way.
Thank you.
So, thanks. So, I just think that if there was one thing to think about, I would dwell on something we haven't discussed here. There's so much to say, but bias. Because too often, I think communities small local communities who are particularly marginal become vulnerable, become marginalized because of their historic space that they take, whether it's caste in some countries, whether it's religion, whether it's what tribe you belong to, where you come from, what you do. So very often we leave those out because we don't appreciate how we unpack and undo and cleanse in some way the biases of where the funds flow, because you say, well, these guys will never learn, or they're too few in number, or it's too hard to work with them, nobody works with them. So I just want to leave this one thought about finance and bias.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to emphasize the point that, given that we're negotiating levels of climate finance and how much will go into adaptation, that we really need to see peace and good governance as adaptation actions, because they really form the foundation and the enabling environment for climate change adaptation to take root, and also enable people to be able to think more long term, which is what adaptation is about. And so we would really encourage donors, and we're really pleased with our partnership with FCDO and that they're already doing this, to include peace and good governance interventions within their adaptation programming, whether those be linked to social cohesion, participatory planning, and conflict resolution, and for implementing partners to break down those silos between peace and climate, because we really need to engage in both spaces at the same time to be effective.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've learned a lot today, and one of the things that I was hearing in just these closing remarks was a note of optimism, might I say. I think that having adapting as part of this session title and also a lot of the conversation around locally led adaptation pulls us forward. And I appreciate the work about climate futures and not just climate crisis. And the framing that, what if we get some of it right? What if we get a lot of it right? And how much different is our world if we are connecting the dots between what government and governance structures can do, what peace and social cohesion efforts can do, and what climate adaptation can do, and how they're all deeply connected. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the fact that donors and implementers, researchers, policymakers can sit on a panel and talk about the potential that we're seeing from this COP and going into the future.
Thank you, everyone. Very quick takeaway from me is that I am actually pleasantly surprised at COP at how much I'm hearing colleagues, participants talk about these issues, the overlap, how we get finance to the places that need it most. I think everyone's very aware of the disparity between needs and climate adaptation financing. So I think that's fantastic. I think what we need now and moving to next year is to see some of that acknowledgement turn into concrete action, and for parties to come to COP next year with really good examples of how they have adapted in adversity and really make good on some of those commitments. I'd like to thank everyone for coming and say a huge thank you to our panel. You've all been absolutely fantastic. Really, really appreciate you taking the time, especially when I know you're all running around COP at 1,000,000 miles an hour. So thank you so much. If you could give them a round of applause, that would be amazing.